Thanks, David, for this kind introduction, and thanks for having me for this webinar today. And also thanks to Eliza for organizing this. It all seems to work well, and happy to have so many participants, although it seems to be like very much sunny all across Europe, basically. And also, of course, welcome from my side. I'm also sitting in Austria at the moment because I am Austrian and I'm working in Siegen, but my home office here is situated in Austria too. So yeah, this talk is about sample selection in systematic literature reviews, and David had also mentioned that this is based on a paper which is forthcoming in ORM, and this paper will be part of a special issue on literature reviews. And I very much focus in this paper on one step within the larger systematic review process, and I focus on sample selection here. And as David has mentioned, the presentation will be made available as a PDF file afterwards, and it's pretty much based on this paper, which you can download, open access. I think Nicholas has already been so kind to post the link in the chat, so we can all access it because it's available open access there at ORM. So why care about this process in the first place? And I think probably many of you are still in your PhD studies, and maybe you all want to survey the literature before adding to the literature. And this is why I think a sound review of the literature is quite important, basically to any PhD thesis, but also to any research project in the first place, because we all will probably want to know what the state of the literature is before trying to add this literature, just to avoid reinventing the wheel, so to say. And we've seen in the literature that the systematic review approach has very much gained importance, and also has been applied more frequently in the past 10 to 20 years or so. And probably the start of this systematic review approach, at least as applied to management research, probably has been the publication by Tranfield and colleagues in the British Journal of Management in 2003, where they have kind of transferred insights on systematic reviews from medical research to business research to management research. And in medicine, it has been applied much longer than in business and management research, and they have transferred the most important ideas to our field. Up to then, probably most papers have been based on more traditional review techniques, and those reviews have been impactful too, for sure, but they had some downsides. For instance, they have not been very transparent in terms of what has been done, what steps have been taken to arrive at those traditional review papers. And this is basically also a criticism, a point of criticism, which has been taken up by Tranfield and colleagues, which is why they suggested to more apply systematic approaches to reviews in management research too. So while this has been gaining popularity over the past 10 to 15 years, there has actually not been so much methodological advice on how to actually do such systematic reviews. Of course, we have this Tranfield paper, which mentions the most important steps, but it's only one paper. And what can you do within one paper? Well, not everything, of course. And so there has been missing some more detailed advice on some of the individual steps of conducting such systematic reviews. And this is basically the motivation for this whole special issue, which is forthcoming in ORM, and it's edited by 5 very prominent scholars here. And I think all the other papers in this special issue are very interesting too, if you want to conduct a review paper on your own. And up to the special issue, which is, I guess, will be available later this year, I guess, in ORM. But up to this special issue, there have been many questions left unresolved. For instance, also related to sample selection. So questions you might encounter when doing such a review. You might ask yourself, should I just search for articles based on keyword search, or should I focus on certain journals in the first place? Should I include just any paper I find, or should I limit the papers I find to a certain time frame? Or should I conduct some quality assessment before including potentially relevant papers in my review sample? So these are all important questions. I think as authors of such review papers, I think we all sooner or later come across these questions. At least in my field, we do come across these questions. And I'm not, originally in management research. I'm an accounting scholar, so apologies up front. So if my examples on management research are not the best chosen, so I am an accountant, please bear that in mind. But also in accounting research, we do come across these questions when doing systematic reviews. And this is why I thought it would be interesting to have some preliminary answers, or at least to highlight the choices you can make when creating a sample for your systematic review. So this is basically the motivation for this paper of mine here. And just as a caveat up front, I will not be able to provide you with definite answers to these questions. And that's also not what I try to do in this paper, but I try to highlight some choices and try how these choices could be addressed when bearing in mind some attributes of systematic reviews that are, that differentiate these systematic reviews from traditional reviews. So where is this sample selection process situated within the larger process conducting systematic reviews? Well, I think it's very important to state up front that usually you do have a research question. Also for systematic reviews, you have one or several research questions which you want to try to answer with the help of systematic review techniques. And this is very much guiding the whole process, this research question. I will refer later back again to this research question, or the centrality of this research question, because what is important, you can actually phrase those questions more narrowly or more widely. So you have discretion as an author in terms of how you want to phrase those research questions. And I think that's true for, I guess, every academic paper in our field, is that one of the key quality criteria of a paper is that you have a good fit between your research question or questions and your findings, your methods, and all the rest of the paper actually. So you need to have this nice fit. You need to have internal consistency in the paper. But the good thing is you have some discretion here for the research questions, just as you have some discretion for empirical papers too, in terms of your research questions. And the rest of the process basically depends on how your research question is phrased. So after you have, found a research question, which is basically part of this planning stage probably. And these three stages here are broad stages as suggested by Tranfield and colleagues in their 23 paper. So the first stage is actually planning the review, where you identify a need for a review. So you need to find a space which has not been so crowded in terms of reviews, where you kind of develop a search strategy, a protocol. And then you come to stage 2, where you actually conduct your review. And I will focus on the first 3 phases, or phases 3 through 5 here in stage 2. So you identify potentially relevant research, you select studies from your list of potentially relevant research items, and probably also do some quality assessment. So Tranfield and colleagues, they advocate for doing such quality assessments. Not all papers do this, but it's usually part of a sound systematic review. This is why it's also part of their stages or their phases here in their paper. And then afterwards, from phase 6 onwards, you work with your review sample. But I'll stop with my paper after phase 5. So this is very much the focus of my paper here. And this is not to say that the phases 0 to 2 and phases 6 to 9 are not important. I think probably the later phases are even more important if you think of trying to publish your review as a standalone paper, which is an option, but which is not necessary You can do this, or you can try to do this. And I think the really juicy part, the really interesting part, they start at phases probably 7 and 8, because here you can try to make a difference in terms of how you analyze the literature in a certain field. But also, of course, the phases 3 through 5 are important, and this is why I focus on them in this paper, because they kind of are a necessary prerequisite if you want to do a sound systematic review, where you later develop important implications for further research and probably also for practice. So it's kind of a necessary prerequisite, but it's not like the key differentiator. So you need to have a sound basis, and this is part of, or the sound basis is laid by a sound sample selection process, but it's not like a guarantee to get published as a standalone paper if you have a sound basis, a sound technical basis. So some other colleagues have commented that what I focus on here is kind of part of the technicalities of a systematic review. It's not actually where you can create your most important contributions to literature. So this is then afterwards, but it's a necessary prerequisite, to have a sound basis. So these steps I'll focus on. And what I did in this exercise here in this paper is I kind of compiled some desired attributes for systematic reviews, which also apply to the sample selection process. So I came up from the related literature with 3 attributes actually. And I then used those attributes to analyze what has been done before in 2 very prominent journals focusing on review papers and management research. But still, when applying those attributes, I found several ways where these earlier papers, could have been conducted even more systematically, even more structured, even more transparently. And so it's important to keep in mind that what I did in this paper is like really deriving those 3 attributes from the related literature, methodological literature, and then applying it to a large sample of earlier systematic reviews. And the first of these attributes is structured. So I think many papers and also books on reviews, they agree that such systematic reviews, they really need to be well structured. And I've included a quote here from the book by Chestnut colleagues, which is a very nice book on systematic reviews. So they said, structured means that a review is conducted in an ordered or methodical way rather than a haphazard or random way. What does it mean for you as potential authors of such reviews? It means basically that all steps, all methodological steps for arriving at your review sample, but also in later stages of the review process, all these steps need to be well explained. They need to be founded, and you just cannot, take arbitrary choices. You just cannot say, well, I just review the last 10 years or so of research, which will be an example I'll use later. So all the steps need to have a sound explanation why you have taken these steps the way you did. So this is what I refer to as structured. Well, the second attribute is comprehensive. Yeah. So you usually want to conduct a review that really comprehensively covers all relevant research. And here, the research question that I mentioned a minute ago comes into play, because what is relevant research for a review? Well, this is basically usually judged based on the research question you give yourself. So relevance is usually judged in terms of in how far an individual research item is relevant to answering your review questions, your research questions, which you have defined up front. So this is one part of relevance, but apart from research questions, you can also have additional criteria, inclusion and exclusion criteria. Also, these inclusion-exclusion criteria, I think you have kind of discretion here as an author. You can choose those inclusion or exclusion criteria as long, and I'm referring back to my first attribute, as long as you explain why you have chosen these exclusion and inclusion criteria. Yeah, so it's important also here for setting up those criteria. It's also important to have these well-founded and not arbitrary. Later in this talk and also in the paper, I refer to the summary term of inclusion exclusion criteria because it very much depends on how you phrase an individual criterion. So you can phrase a criterion as either inclusive or exclusive. For instance, you can say I only include journal articles that are published in journals that carry a ABS rank 4 or so, which would be quite exclusive, yeah. But you could also phrase it as I will exclude everything that does not carry grade 4 or I'll exclude all grade 1, 2, 3 journals and all journals that are not ranked in the ABS guide. So this would be phrased as an exclusion criteria. But it very much depends on your personal preferences, how you phrase this. This is why I always refer to the summary term inclusion and exclusion criteria. And comprehensive just means then that you include all relevant research items, all items that are relevant and that adhere to your research questions and that are in line with your inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then the third one is, the third attribute is transparent. So this is also very much kind of distinguishing systematic reviews from traditional reviews. And transparent is very important because the reader needs to know how you arrived at your review sample. So you should transparently report on all the methodological steps that you took to arrive at this sample. And there's some debate going on whether transparency leads to actual replicability of a review paper, a systematic review. And I also had some discussions with my very very constructive reviewers here. I had 3 for this paper, and it was really a very good process there. Very good reviews, very constructive, but also very challenging. And one thing they challenged is that I think in earlier versions of the paper, I had something in there like transparent should enable readers to actually replicate your sample selection. But I think I later changed this to that fellow researchers or readers should be able to trace the sample selection, which is not the same as replicate a sample selection. They should be at least able to trace what you've done, because even if you report on all those steps in a very transparent manner, if you have a very structured approach, if you have a comprehensive review sample, it might still be that some subjective choices are to be made by you and your co-authors potentially, which means that you can either go right or left way, and this will prevent full replicability, but it will at least allow the reader to trace what you've done. And if the reader is able to trace what you've done, then you have kind of transparently reported on what you've done for arriving at your review sample. And also an important part here is that you kind of disclose the final review sample so that everybody knows, or the reader knows, what is actually in your review sample and what is not. So these are the 3 attributes which have been around in the literature for some time. I've probably changed the labels a bit in comparison to some other sources, but these are 3 attributes I have used for my paper here. And if we put it together, well, you have this this systematic review question, which is guiding actually all of the process here. So you have this guiding review question, you have those 3 decide attributes: structured, comprehensive, and transparent, and you have 3 sub steps of the process, which are similar to those that have been mentioned by Tranfield and colleagues. So it's the identification of potentially relevant research question. It's the screening or the selection of studies from this initial list of research items, and then you disclose kind of the review sample. Those quality assessments that have been mentioned by Tranfield as separate steps, I've included them here in the screening part. But to move to the identification part first, so this is all derived from earlier methodological research on reviews, not only from management research, but also from other fields such as medical research. So you first search for relevant research items, and there are several approaches we'll discuss in a minute or so, which you can choose from. Then you can apply already to this list some non-content related inclusion and exclusion criteria. What do you mean by non-content related? Well, you can apply those inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria without even looking into the content of the potentially relevant research items. So without looking into the papers, actually, you can already exclude papers because they have been published in a year you don't want to include. You just want to exclude certain timeframes, for instance. You want to exclude certain journals, certain fields of research. Maybe you also want to exclude research that has not been published in English language, for instance, which can also be an exclusion criterion. And you can well judge on those criteria without even looking into the content of the paper, just by the metadata, which is available in quite some of the databases you can use for searching articles. So you can already, at the identification step, include or exclude papers based on non-content related criteria. And then you usually end up with a long list, potentially thousands of papers that are in your list then. And then you screen those papers for fit with your research question and for your further inclusion and exclusion criteria. And there you have several choices in terms of how you want to organize this screening process. I will mention those choices later in this talk. And then you can apply actually content related criteria. So you really need to look into those papers to be able to assess whether your paper fits in or fits with those criteria or does not fit with those criteria. And this also includes quality assessments, at least if you do quality assessments by actually reading or analyzing the papers. So there might be a discussion here, and I'll answer this question up front, because you can also do quality assessment basically with non-content related inclusion exclusion criteria. But this would probably then be done based on journal rankings or so, which is an approach that has been followed frequently also in the papers I analyzed. So you can just say, as I mentioned it a minute ago, I only want to include like ABS grade 4 papers or grade 3 papers upwards, whatever. This could be done based on actually a non-content related criterion, which is just the ABS ranking, yeah, whether these journals carry a rank of 3 or above. But many methodological papers on reviews and systematic reviews to rather advise against such journal-based quality assessments, although they are frequently applied. Yeah? And I've applied those in my reviews, my early reviews too. So it's not like it's not been done. But if you would do quality assessments based on journal rankings, then of course those quality assessments would be part of this non-content related inclusion and exclusion criteria. Yeah, and after you have applied your inclusion exclusion criteria, you're finally set with your review sample, which you can work with and which you can really try to tease out interesting implications for further research. And as I mentioned before, where the really juicy, the really interesting part or really creative part of doing reviews then starts. And what you do usually in your paper, or also if you conduct a review as part of your thesis or so, or part of a book project, then you disclose the final list of your research items included in the systematic review, which is basically the last step here in my process, disclosure of the review sample. And for the rest of this talk, we'll run through these steps and what has been done in terms of these steps in those 2 nice journals. And I will, as I mentioned, apply those 3 attributes, structured, comprehensive, and transparent, to critically analyze what has been done before. So how did I put together my sample? Well, I focused on 2 journals, which is basically a convenient samples, but those 2 journals, the Academy of Management Annals and the International Journal of Management Reviews, they can be probably considered as the two most prominent outlets and the two most cited outlets that are exclusively devoted to review papers in management research. And they also carry quite high impact factors if you want to measure it that way. So I think the Academy of Management Annals is still the #1 journal in terms of impact factor in the management field. And then I tried to identify systematic reviews within those two journals, between those reviews published between 2004 and 2018. So I excluded everything before 2004 because 2003 was the year when the Tranfield et al. Paper was published. And just to kind of check the robustness of this choice, I also searched for IJMR articles published before 2004 for words such as systematic, but I didn't find any of these. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that only starting with 2004, systematic reviews really appeared in those two journals. But still, not all of these papers published between 2004 and 2018 were systematic reviews, and I needed to identify those which can be considered systematic in some sense. And I used a rather, relaxed criterion to identify those systematic reviews. So what I used as my criterion, as my overriding criterion to include those articles, which can be considered systematic, was that those articles disclosed their own inclusion-exclusion criteria in some way. So usually they had a methods section within those papers, or at least within the appendix of these papers. For some earlier papers, it was sometimes found in the appendix only, where systematic reviews were not that prominent at that time. And I excluded every or all other papers which did not disclose their own inclusion or exclusion criteria for putting together the review sample. So this was my criterion for identifying systematic reviews. This means that not all of the papers I have in my sample, they would have declared themselves as systematic, but they at least showed some features of a systematic review. And besides those articles that did not feature any, inclusion or exclusion criteria, also excluded articles that were geared toward bibliometric analysis, because they usually have very large samples, like 500 or 600, which are usually not, not feasible to be analyzed in a narrative way, which most other review papers I have in my review sample have been done. So those bibliometric analyses have been excluded too, because they also have often have kind of more relaxed criteria for inclusion to put together these large samples for bibliometric analyses. And using these steps, I ended up with 232 systematic reviews, 56 published in the Academy of Management Annals, and 176 from IJMR. So the share of IJMR articles is larger than those published in the Academy of Management Annals. This, to a certain extent, this can be explained by the fact that the annals have only been published like not for the whole time frame, but only started out later, I think towards the end of the first decade of the millennium, and IJMR was around longer. And what I found in the last year of my sample, which is covered by my sample in 2018, more than 80% of reviews were already systematic reviews. So this share went up quite dramatically over time. And as of 2018, 80% of the reviews have already been or could be considered as systematic. So this is why I ended up with the assessment that systematic reviews probably have become the new normal when it comes to reviews of management research. And then I coded those articles. It was well kind of a painful exercise, actually, because I coded every paper along 50 dimensions, and 21 of those dimensions were derived from prior literature, and I came up with 29 new codings, so 29 inductively created codes, which means 50 times 232, 11,600 codings, so quite a lot. And then I also involved a research assistant who coded all papers, so all 11,600 codings independently from me. And we came up with a very high level of intercode agreement of more than 99%. And there were some, cases left to be resolved, but those could be resolved, and then we actually agreed on those codes. And this coding exercise comes with several, but one very important limitation I need to mention up front here is that we could only code what was mentioned in the article. Yeah, so we could not, code all the steps that were not reported by the authors of these papers. For some papers, there were also available online appendices, which is a very good way to publish also some details of your sample selection process, and which has been used more frequently by more recent papers. And but this limitation, okay, you can say this is a limitation. Of course, it's an important limitation, but we are reviewing systematic reviews here, and we kind of assumed, or I kind of assumed, that if you want to have a systematic review or publish a systematic review, you can usually assume that you want to be transparent. So my hope is, or my guess is, that most papers and most authors have reported on all relevant steps, so that we really could capture all the relevant information by coding the information that is present in the published version of the articles. So what did we come up with? So first, we looked into some non-content related inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the first of these criteria is the time period covered. As I mentioned before, as an open question for review papers, you can select, well, which time frame do I want to cover in my review sample? And there are several choices you can make here. And interestingly, quite some papers, they didn't actually disclose. So this is the bottom line here. Several papers did not disclose the time period that was covered by their reviews, which of course is not very transparent. So these were like 41 papers out of 232, which is of course not very transparent, not very structured, and should be avoided probably for you as future authors of such reviews. And another not very well transparent way of reporting on time frame, that they did actually limit the time frame to some years. For instance, or on average, they limited the time frame to 24 years. What you can see here, so the mean is 24 years covered by those reviews, and 36 papers, they didn't say why. Why did I limit time frame to an average of 24 years? Yeah, so there was no reason given, which of course too is not very transparent, or does leave a very structured impression. And other kind of questionable reasons for limited time frame are those which are marked with those red arrows here. Whereas the others, so the choices A, F, G, and H, are probably more systematic, or at least geared towards more systematically or more transparently reporting on what you've done. But choice B2 is kind of questionable. It's limited to round lots. So they kind of limited the time frame to round lots. For instance, saying, well, I will review the last 10 years of research on topics X, Y, Z, or last 15 years, or last 20 years. But why the last 10 years? Why the last 15 years? Why the last 20 years? They didn't give a reason beyond just limiting their review sample to the last X years. And interestingly, they covered 17 years on average, which is not that much in comparison to other choices, which you can see here in this table. And they also did not cover an extraordinarily high number of research items in their sample. So on average, those limited to round lots, they covered 156 research items, whereas the grand mean is 139. So it's a bit above average, yes, but not so much above average, that you would need to really limit your review sample to the last 10 or 15 years. Another interesting explanation for limiting the time frame was that some papers said that they only want to cover a very dynamic research field, and most research has been published only recently. Yeah. Period. That was the explanation. This was done in 10 articles, and yeah, it's not very transparent why most recent research only, why not cover everything. Yeah. So, and why have a review sample that is not that large on average? You see 138 papers included on average in those papers, having followed this choice in terms of time frames, so not very transparent to, not very structured to. Some others said that a similar reasoning was that they followed or only included research that has been following recent developments in research, so also referring to some developments which were not really explicated, which were not made very transparent, also not the most transparent, most structured choice. And similarly, some said, okay, they focus on a very dynamic topic and only want to capture the latest developments in this topic. This reasoning was only applied by 5 papers in my review sample, but here you could say, okay, they covered 300 papers on average, which is quite a lot for a narrative reporting of those review findings. But 2, you could say here, well, is this really transparent or very structured? I guess not. So these were the not best practice examples first, but there are some other examples, of course, which probably more qualify for a structured, transparent, and comprehensive sample selection. And many papers, actually the largest group, 78 papers, they just said, okay, the time frame we covered, it basically results from our search. So they did not limit the time frame in the first place because they were the first review on this very topic in the literature. So of course they covered or tried to cover everything that was there, which means that for some papers they covered a very large time frame of up to 124 years. Yeah, a large time frame, and on average they covered 31 years. So this was quite a high number here in terms of 124 years. And on average, they covered 109 articles. So not too much, but this probably can be explained by the choice of the research question. If you are the first to do a review on a specific research question, yeah, you can leave the time frame unlimited, which is basically not a bad choice because you just cover everything which has been done so far. Another probably quite systematic and structured choice is that an earlier review on your topic exists. So you're not the first, but the second review in a certain field. And then some papers said, okay, I will cover the time period that has elapsed since this earlier review has been published, or their final year of the sample of this earlier review. So this has been done by 9 papers. And it's interesting to see that the average number or the average number of years covered in those papers is 15. So which could be used as a rough estimate for you if there has been done an earlier review. On average, the follow-up review, is done or can be done 15 years after that, but as early as 6 years, because this is the minimum number here for these articles. If, of course, a large enough number of papers or research items has been published, which basically is the case here because they, on average, they have included 197 papers. Another well-structured reason is practice developments. This wasn't done by so many reviews, but for instance, one review said, okay, we will cover all research that has been done on a certain ISO standard. I think it was ISO 14001 or so. And they basically covered all the research after this ISO standard has been published. So they started the time frame with the year this standard has been published, which is a clearly well-founded reason for starting the time frame of the review sample. And finally, several papers started with some seminal research items. For instance, a seminal book, a very important book that has been published on that topic, or several important books or articles that have been done on a certain topic, and then they start their time frame with the publication year of this important book, for instance, and then they cover everything that has been done afterwards. So those reasons A, F, G, and H probably are more prone to be structured and transparent and lead to a comprehensive review sample in terms of covering everything that is relevant to a certain research question. The other ones, those marked with red arrows, probably should be avoided as far as possible. And then if you have decided on a certain time frame which you want to cover, then you can choose between several search approaches actually. And I came up with basically 4 principal search approaches you can use to search for relevant literature. And I have named these journal-driven, database-driven, and seminal work-driven. And then you can have combinations of the first 3 search approaches. The first is journal-driven, and here you kind of pre-select some journals which you want to search for relevant articles. Yeah, you come up with 10 to 15 important journals, and then you only search those journals for relevant articles. So this is this journal-driven approach. It usually is reported in a very transparent manner. It's fairly easy to report this in a transparent manner. You have automatically more or less covered the research published in the most important journals, because you wouldn't, focus on 10 to 15 minor journals. You would only probably choose the most important journals here in your field. You can also, be quite sure that that the rigor of those research items included in a review sample is quite guaranteed, or kind of guaranteed, because those major journals, they have usually quite rigorous review processes too. And well, the search process is probably easier or less tedious, as I've put it here, than for database driven approaches. But also you have some disadvantages here, because potentially your review sample is just very selective or less comprehensive. You only focus on most important management and organization studies journals. But for any given research question for a review sample, also research from other fields might be important. For instance, from sociology or from, I don't know, psychology or whatever. Also, papers published in those other fields could be important for your research question, but if you focus on 10 to 15 most important journals, you probably exclude just a large amount of literature or a large amount of research that could be interesting and relevant for you. So, and what is also not often done here for journal-driven approaches is snowballing and literature. I'll come to that in a second. So, well, those could be made more comprehensive, those journal-driven approaches. The other approach, the other often followed approach, is the database-driven approach, where you don't select, a certain bunch of journals. You search in several electronic databases with the help of keywords. So you can find large numbers of research. You usually end up with thousands of search hits. And you can also easily, find research that you've not known before, because probably the most important articles in your field of review from the most important journals, but probably you come across several further articles that you've not known before. Or you could also include journal that is not content that has not been published in journals, or that is only available in the gray literature. So you can create a very comprehensive sample here, yes, but the search process might be quite tedious. It might, the reporting on this might need a lot of space, because you would need to report on all the search terms, all the keywords, all the individual databases you've used. And this space has long not been available in usual journal articles, but nowadays you can use online appendices for reporting these details, so that readers can really trace your sample selection. So it's a lot easier to report all these details today than, say, in 2004 or so. And you have what you have here usually is a labor-intensive screening process, because you can really end up with thousands of hits. So it will be, of course, yeah, as I mentioned, more tedious than for the journal-driven approach usually. Okay, for implications, I'll get to this later, or skip it for now. And the third basic approach is seminal work-driven, where you kind of identify a very important research item, a book or a very important journal article, for instance. I think one of the papers in my review paper was following the literature after DiMaggio and Powell, this iron cage paper, institutional theory and isomorphism was discussed in this paper. And they have just followed all the research that has been published after this DiMaggio and Powell paper has been published. And they don't usually, those seminal work-driven approaches don't usually openly search for papers, but they rather screen the citations of this seminal work or seminal works for inclusion in the review, which makes sense, because if you want to capture a review field that has originated from one single paper, one single book, you can easily just track the citations and the citations. You can have various instances here for inclusion in the review sample. So it's quite a different approach. You don't search for articles, you search the citations for inclusion in your review sample. And it's usually very comprehensive, because if a certain article, certain book really defines a research field, well, it's easy to be comprehensive in terms of citations, because, for instance, Google Scholar is very, very comprehensive in terms of covering citations, but you can also use other databases for this one. But it's usually, you have a comprehensive coverage, but sometimes it's questionable when you have not only one seminal work, but several seminal works. So how do you define what is really seminal for being the start of a research field? It's not always that easy as for this iron cage example I just mentioned. And some papers, they use then citations in terms of, these are the 5 most cited papers on a certain topic. They have been published in 1980 or so. I'm just making up something now. And then I'll track all citations of these 5 original papers, yeah? So this is a bit of tricky, and also the coverage of citation varies between databases, yeah? It varies between Google Scholar and, say, Web of Science and Scopus, for instance. Google Scholar usually covers more citations than the other 2. So it very much depends on which citations you track or which database you use for tracking citations. And as for all the other choices, you just need to explain why you've chosen certain citations. So, for instance, Google Scholar, because it's most comprehensive. That's a pretty straightforward reason, I guess. But you probably need to disclose this and need to be aware that citation coverage varies between databases. And yeah, there are combined approaches. Some papers also use several approaches. Usually they have combined the journal-driven and the database-driven approach, which is, I think, a good choice, because it usually safeguards a very comprehensive sample selection, because you kind of capitalize the strengths of the first 2 approaches, or the other approaches, to put it more openly, and try to alleviate most of the other approaches' disadvantages, for instance, the disadvantages of the journal-driven approach and the disadvantages of the database-driven approach. But on the other hand, of course, yeah, it's even more tedious to conduct 2 searches or follow 2 search approaches. And so the search approach is more, or the search is more tedious, but also the screening is more tedious. So these are the 4 search approaches. And then I found that some of these search approaches are more prominent in some of the journals, or the 2 journals I covered. Basically, it seems like those journal-driven approaches, they are more usual in the annals, which could be attributed to kind of a more American approach, North American approach to conducting reviews. So more like select 10 to 15 premier journals, like the usual suspects. So Academy of Management journals, Academy of Management Journal Review, and Perspectives, Potential Discoveries now, yeah, and some other usual suspects such as the Journal of Management, Journal of Management Studies, ASQ, Journal of Applied Psychology, Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science, Organization Studies. So these are the usual suspects, basically, when you have this journal-driven approach. And then they just focus on these journals for creating their review paper. But this is more prominent in the Academy of Management Annals and less prominent in IGMR. You see, just 19% of all papers published in IGMR, they follow this approach, whereas it's 57% for the annals papers. But for the database-driven approach, kind of this is the other way around, because here it's much less common so far in the annals and much more common in IGMR. So what I had in early versions of the paper was like, you could see kind of a European approach to doing systematic reviews, which is more like the IGMR approach, because many IGMR authors are from European institutions, and more like the American approach of systematic reviews, which is more well present in the Academy of Management Annals. I later took this out because, you know, I couldn't really, it was just a paper that got too long. And so, but you can have some journal preferences here in terms of which journal or database-driven approaches you usually see in these journals. Seminal work-driven was not that common, but it's still a clearly distinct approach. And combined approaches were also not yet that common, but more often seen in IGMR so far. Okay, so these are the journals. And then you can, if you choose the database-driven approach, then probably a follow-up question you'd have is, which databases should I choose in management research? And I also looked into those databases, which were mentioned in the papers. And on average, and this is on the panel B here at the bottom of this slide, on average, you have 3 databases which have been used. So this is true for the mean number, but also for the median number. So 3 databases on average, which is a rough estimate for your own systematic review. But if you choose 3 databases, well, you need to be aware of which databases to choose, because some have mixed such multi-publisher databases, as I call them here: EBSCO, Web of Science, ABI Inform, Google, PsycInfo, Cyclid, and JSTOR, Scopus, all what I termed multi-publisher databases, because these databases don't just include journals that are published by one publisher, such as Elsevier, Wiley, Sage, Springer Nature, Emerald, and you name it. So these include journals from several publishers, whereas some papers in my sample, they also drew on publisher-specific databases, such as Science Direct, which is only including, of course, articles published by Elsevier. So it's not like that any 3 databases would do, but if you ask me which databases to choose, I'd probably go for these multi-publisher databases because they have a larger coverage. For accounting research, where my field is, probably I choose like EBSCO, Web of Science, and Scopus, for instance, and probably also augment this by with other multi-publisher databases. And it might still make sense to have some publisher-specific databases in there, because not all multi-publisher databases include in-press articles or forthcoming articles. This has changed now for the Web of Science after my review sample has been formed, because up till then they did not include in-press articles, but now I think they do. And also Scopus does so. Also Google Scholar, of course, does so. I don't think that ProQuest yet includes in-press articles, and I also think that EBSCO doesn't include forthcoming in-press articles. So you need to keep in mind that still, while using multiple publisher databases, you would need to capture also in-press and forthcoming articles to have really a comprehensive sample. And you can see the percentages here, which articles used databases, and on average, EBSCO was the most used one here. And Scopus, for instance, not that much so far, which I find quite astonishing, because as of my experience, that's pretty good to use for systematic reviews. It's the algorithms do work very well there, such as, and also for Web of Science, they work very well usually. So Scopus hasn't been used so far, but I think maybe this will increase in the future. And you can see the maximum number is 12 databases here. So some papers have really just used all databases, which of course creates a lot of duplicate search hits, but still you can be sure that you're rather comprehensive then. Okay, what else did I find? Well, the screening process, yeah. So one step that you need to decide on for a screening process is that you start with a long list of search hits now. Yeah, you have like thousands or up to thousands of search hits now, and you kind of need to make sense which of these 1,000 articles to really include in your review sample, because if you have thousands of articles, you usually won't be able to report them all, the findings all in a narrative review. So you need to first scan or screen those articles. The usual first steps reported in my review sample were that you scan titles, abstracts, author-defined keywords for content fit with the review question, and not going into the full text yet. So really start only with abstracts, titles, and keywords. And a quite a very useful technique, which was mentioned in some papers, was a kind of ABC logic. You can do this in cases of multiple authors, or if you're happy enough to have a research assistant, just as I had with my paper here, you can employ this ABC logic where you kind of assign letters to each research item. A stands for very irrelevant, B potentially relevant, and C not relevant. And then you can kind of sort out all the C's in the first one. Or you can use interquarter agreement statistics, so you can really report in a very transparent and structured manner how you kind of narrowed down this long list of thousands of articles to a manageable amount of articles or research items. And you usually then end up including all the A's, and for the B's, you probably need to look into the content, into the full text of the paper to really make sense of whether this paper or this research item is relevant for your research question. And some papers also just then skip the B papers because saying, well, we have enough A papers and let's skip the B papers, which is, well, kind of questionable, because then you could have just used an A-B approach in the first place, but still it makes sense if you have several authors in a review paper that every author, or at least two authors, run through all potentially relevant search items and assign them A, B, or C, and then you can generate interquarter agreement and so on, and really screen this list in a structured way. And another choice you can do is, or you can make, is whether you focus on empirical and non-empirical research items, which was done in quite a number of papers here in my review sample, because 56 articles, they focused on empirical research only, and 3 only focused on non-empirical items, whereas the rest, they covered both empirical and non-empirical articles. You just need to, make sure that you transparently report on this choice, and potentially also include it already in your research question that you only want to review the empirical literature. What was interesting here is because those 56 articles that only covered empirical research, they mostly just did not explain this choice. They just ignored non-empirical articles without, disclosing reasons why they ignored these articles. So it's not fully structured if you just ignore a part of the literature without saying why. So all these articles, or these articles that didn't mention reasons, they could have been presented in a more structured and a more transparent way still. And then we come to the quality assessment. So 56 articles, they explicitly refer to quality assessment, which is not that much, because you remember like 232 were in my review sample, and only 57, they explicitly refer to quality assessments. And 36 of those, they used journal rankings. So it was not really a content-related inclusion or exclusion criterion. It was more like a non-content related. But this could be problematic because you basically refer a part of your sample selection process or your choices to the authors of such rankings. You just kind of, well, it's easy, yes, but it's not your choice anymore. And there are other methods to assess the quality of review items or research items. And those remaining articles, they mostly did not, explain their quality assessment. They just said, okay, we have excluded whatever 200 articles based on quality assessment, without saying which kind of quality assessment they performed, which of course is not very transparent, not very structured. But some notable exceptions exist, like the Nguyen et al. Paper in IJMR, and also the Pittaway et al. Paper in IJMR of 2004. So you could revert to those papers for getting a feeling of how such alternative quality assessments might look like. But I can always tell you that this would further increase the workload in terms of making sure that all the papers have sufficient quality. So it's quite tedious too to follow these approaches, but still it's not transferring your choices to the authors of journal rankings, at least. And another criterion that has been often quite sometimes is that the author said, okay, we have only included articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, which may have been a sound choice, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. But nowadays, I would really, caution you to rely on this criterion, because also these predatory journals, which are all around the place, and they kind of operate on a pay-for-publication basis. You just send in the paper, and 5 days later, it's accepted after a full review process, of course, which is not very realistic. So I wouldn't rely on those journals, but those journals still, they pretend to feature peer review processes. And so the criterion that a journal says we have peer review processes is not reliable anymore, because you also include all those predatory journals. So before relying on this criterion, I'd rather revert to journal rankings again, where most of the predatory journals are excluded, or the better way would even be to do your own quality assessments, for instance, following the approaches by Nguyen et al. And Pittaway et al. So, and finally, we already arrived at the last step of the sample selection process, disclosing the review sample. As I mentioned before, where the average number of research items included in those review samples was 139. So the average article included 139 research items in their review samples, which is quite a lot, I guess. But you can also tease out some other statistics here, because only 84% they disclosed in my review sample, they disclosed the number of research items included in their samples, and only 50%, only half of the articles, they reported a full list of research items included in the review sample. For the other half, it was not clear which articles, which research items were really in their review samples, which of course is not very transparent, it's not very structured, and also cannot give you a feeling whether this review sample is comprehensive or not. So 139 on average. The very minimum numbers are 13 to 18, but I guess those are really outliers. I'd rather revert to the median numbers, or to an 80% range, which excludes the 10% of with the largest number of review research items, and 10% of the lowest number of research items in the samples. And these ranges, they go from 42 to 265. So I guess if you are in that range, you still have a review sample that is potentially large enough to be published as a standalone paper, which is one criterion, of course, that was mentioned earlier by Jeremy Short, I think in a commentary published in Journal of Management, where he said, okay, for publishing a standalone review paper, you need to have a sample that is just large enough. And I think these numbers, these ranges can give you an indication whether your review sample is large enough, but still the size of your review sample very much depends on your research question, and you just can't have a definite answer what is large enough and what not. So to summarize, there are several choices to be made as part of the sample selection process. I've just, basically summarized what I've already said, I hope, yeah. So when limiting the time period, of course, you should have clear reasons. You should explain the reasons why you've limited the time frame, or if there hasn't been done any review before in your topic, just leave the time frame unlimited so that you really cover everything and not, rely on those rather arbitrary reasons for limiting the time frame. You can then select the principal search approach. If you want to be really sure that you're comprehensive, potentially go for a combined approach consisting of the journal-driven approach, where you include the most important journals in the field you wanna position your review in, coupled with a keyword search. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages for all individual approaches, but a combination of journal-driven and keyword approach is probably the safest for most topics. Of course, if you have a clear seminal work that you can follow in your review, that's even more probably a comprehensive, very structured choice if you go for this seminal work approach. Well, another choice that has been done by some papers is that they included research items based on individuals' knowledge and manual searches, as they call it, some papers. And this also includes some suggestions by reviewers of such review articles, which come along with, well, great paper, but you have missed some important papers, A, B, C, D, all published by me, but the reviewers won't say so. So the question is, how do you include those? Individual suggestions or manual searches, you could call it? You can, of course, include also some expert recommendations in there. But if you have a sound search approach, then probably most of those expert recommendations should be covered anyway. If you get these recommendations, probably you should rethink your search approach to really adapt your search approach to really cover also these other things. And some authors also, also selected only the most cited research items, which can also be a quality inclusion criterion, but which again needs to be well coupled with your research question, because if you just want to cover everything, then it's not clear why you want to cover only the most cited items then. So this is also something which you need to explain very well. I've already talked about the screening process in terms of ABC logic, which is a very good way to organize the screening process if you have several authors or research assistant. I've already talked about quality assessments. Yeah, and also in terms of quality assessment, you could report on which articles you have excluded, just as for other inclusion-exclusion criteria, because nowadays we have these online appendices for many journals where you have unlimited space to report on all these more detailed choices, just to make sure that readers who are really interested in how you constructed your research, your review sample, they can really look this up in online appendices. Yeah, and of course, very important, transparently disclose the review sample when you have, well, constructed a review sample. Be sure to really report what's in and what's not in. And yeah, one final word of caution. I've mentioned this before, but some, especially from my experience, some more junior scholars, just like my PhD students, they very much focus on these technicalities. Yeah, to have a comprehensive sample, to report this in a transparent way, to really be sure that everything is covered. But then again, the analysis kind of falls short or is not that interesting. And I'd like to mention this again, yeah, that the primary value of your review paper and the reason why this may get published as a standalone paper, which is not necessary in the first place, but just in case you want to try this, to get this published as a standalone paper, you need to make sure that the primary value usually stems from the insights, from the implications you generate based on your analysis of the review sample. You won't get published just for having a very structured, very transparent, very comprehensive sample. This is, again, just a prerequisite for creating a very impactful review paper. Okay, and finally, yeah, it's certainly not rocket science. So if you take time and if you discuss with your supervisors and with experts in the field, I think you've got very good chances if you really take the steps serious here. You end up with a sound review sample. And then, of course, the really juicy parts, as I mentioned, they only start then when you have your real sample. So that's it from my side, and I'd like to have or leave some time for questions still, or for answering your question. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope there were some insights that might be helpful to you, and we can then turn to your questions.